Well, I think first of all, we have to realize that the national security has really fundamentally changed in the 21st century. When you look at globalization and the internet, rather than taking the fight abroad, which we have essentially conditioned the joint force to the fact that we're going to fight abroad to protect the homeland, that in reality, the fight's been brought home while we were away. And it's been brought into our living rooms, it's been brought into our homes, it's been brought into our businesses, it's been brought into our institutions like academia and politics and Wall Street and the corporate sector. And if we don't understand how that aspect of national security is contributing to the erosion of democratic principles, then we don't really understand how we provide for the common defense as outlined in the Constitution. And so really understanding how all of these things factor together, whether it be economics, finance, trade, investment, media, politics, academia, the internet, how it all kind of melds together in a globalized, internet-connected world, and then allows adversaries that don't share the principles, any of the principles of the liberal democratic order, and allows them to have purchase inside your society, then you're not really aware of your surroundings. And I think that's the big challenge that I 5 years ago became aware of as I started to be much more connected to the corporate sector than I was in the military sense. So we talk about DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, economic, but we don't actually practice it in a way that, I remember having one series of discussions in the National Security Council where we talked about the fact China was offering a domestic bond, dollar-denominated bond on the market that was 11 times oversubscribed, meaning there was a lot of demand for this thing that was going to cause our retirement funds to be invested in China. And into companies like Aviation Industry Corporation of China, which is, I think, the second largest defense contractor in China. So here we were, a situation in the National Security Council talking about where American dollars were going to be invested in the weapons production of our adversary, and here National Security Council professionals, the establishment was not really aware either that this was going on or the implications of it. And really, unless you were in the industry, unless you were in Wall Street, unless you were in the investment industry, you wouldn't be aware of these things. So really, it requires you to get outside of your comfort zone, which is really about the battlefield as we know it, and go into the battlefield that actually exists in the 21st century, which is really in our day-to-day lives. And so it really requires that information leaders get their hands dirty in areas where they, quite frankly, haven't spent too much time. We have to understand that we are moving into a completely different environment with regard to information technology. So we're going from a 4G world to a 5G world. If you go back to 2007 in the 4G world, that was the year the iPhone debuted. If you look at, for instance, our economy at the time, the top 5 companies in market capitalization were AT&T, General Electric, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, and Shell. So what did Steve Jobs do when he introduced the iPhone? Of course, Steve Ballmer laughed and said, who's going to buy a $500 subsidized device? Well, what Steve Jobs was doing in creating the platform for the mobile computing environment, when that was paired with 4G networks, which came along really a couple years later, he was providing the means for transforming not just our domestic economy, but the global economy. So in 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, the top 5 in market cap went from those companies to Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and Microsoft. And so we went to the FANGs, where the FANGs were really dominant in the global marketplace. Now, what did that create? That created this awareness of the challenge with regard to privacy in a 4G world, right? So the smartphone collects all kinds of data about you, about who you are, your habit patterns, even knows your gait, knows your voice patterns. All of this data can be collected, and using big data analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning can be created or made into information that can be used to influence you to buy shoes or go to a particular event. Well, as this transformation was happening, our adversaries were looking at this transformation and saying that's very amazing and incredible, and maybe we should think about it. So in 2009, China began to think about, hey, how about if we dominate this 5G world? Well, you have to look at how 5G differs from 4G. So 4G, you have a smartphone, that's a platform. You have a 4G network, that's a pipe. That's not 5G. 5G really is about the platform being the network itself. And so in 5G, the iPhone and the Android phone goes away, and you're dealing now with a computing platform that is also the network. What does that mean? That means you walk outside your door, you say Uber, and an Uber a camera recognizes your face, reads your lips, knows who you are, sends a car, you get in the car, and it takes you on your way. All of that data that's being collected, the cameras, the microphones, the machines that are connected in a smart city, all that data then becomes usable for businesses like Uber, businesses like Amazon, businesses like Google, but also businesses like Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. And if you read the report, Engineering Global Consent by Samantha Hoffman, you realize that those companies in China, in addition to wanting to sell you things, so on 11/11, Singles Day in China this year or last year, Alibaba made $38 billion in one single day. In addition to want to sell you things, they want to create intelligence collection for the PLA and influence for the Communist Party. And so these become very powerful platforms. So in that report that I just mentioned, GTCom, which is a company that's mentioned in that report, it collects 2 to 3 petabytes of data per year to do language translation in 65 languages. At the same time, it sends that 2 to 3 petabytes of data to the intelligence arm of the PLA and to the influence arm of the Chinese Communist Party to do other things with that data. So that's the world that we're moving into, that we're stepping into. And quite frankly, it's a world that we're not, as a democracy, either in the United States or really anywhere, really capable of responding to in a way that promotes and preserves our representative government. And so we need to think about the implications of that. And then, information leaders in the Department of Defense, who really should be the experts at explaining the implications of this to national security leaders, need to understand the implications and need to understand that it's not just about electronic warfare on the battlefield. It's not just about protecting DoD networks. If your entire society, the foundation upon which it is built in terms of private property and intellectual property and democratic principles and rule of law and civil rights and human rights, if all of those things are simultaneously being eroded, not just in your own country, but in democracies abroad, then what are you doing in protecting your own networks or providing electronic warfare services on the battlefield? You're really essentially as a leader, you're being outflanked, and you're being outflanked, and your adversary is going to the heart of your weakness. And so understanding what these new information technologies are, understanding the business environment, the social layer and the technology layer, how they come together to create these changes in the corporate sector that, quite frankly, are outstripping the Department of Defense and other democracies' military's capability to respond to it. And then trying to come up with ways, primarily public-private partnership ways that allow democracies to deal with it, I think are some of the key issues that information leaders are going to have to deal with in the coming decades. Whether or not the Chinese Communist Party is incapable of continuing their, essentially totalitarian rule over China is really, it's impossible to say. What I can say is that by supporting it through allowing access to our markets, allowing access to our innovation, allowing access to our technology, talent, and capital, that we actually provide a lifeline for the Chinese Communist Party to not only to continue to influence our own society, but to continue to oppress our own people, putting Uyghurs in concentration camps, doing forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience. All of these things, in trying to create these, and it's a false narrative, in trying to find these areas of common cooperation, when an adversary essentially repudiates everything that you stand for and is bound and determined to suppress those things, not just because of who you are, but because they're afraid of those things taking root in their own society and within their own population, then you realize it becomes an existential threat. And particularly if they're so tightly connected to your society, then they have the means to suppress that threat, and they're bound and determined to do so. And so things like, inviting the PLA to RIMPAC, or having cooperative endeavors where you seek to find ways where the Chinese Communist Party is going to try to coexist with the United States. If you look at document number 9, which is an internal Communist Party document, you realize that coexistence is not possible for the Communist Party because it actually sees the things that we believe in, the values, the fundamentals, the principles of democracy and human rights as a threat to their continued rule. They see the ability to have open markets, the ability to have access to our capital markets, the ability to export things to us without the requirement of tariffs, because they need to have jobs in China. They need to have continued economic growth, primarily export-led economic growth in China. Then you see that they're going to continue to present this false narrative that says that we seek areas of common cooperation, and that there is essentially a place where we could get to where there's a coexistence possible. I don't believe that's the case. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party wants to exist in a world where the United States is a powerful, thriving democracy. And so then you have to think about, how do we protect our own society? How do we protect other democracies? And then let the weight of the Chinese Communist Party determine, whether or not it's sustainable within China. It certainly shouldn't be sustainable globally, but, and I believe that, once cut off from technology, talent, capital, and innovation from the West, that the Chinese Communist Party will essentially crumble over the weight of, its own oppressive nature. It doesn't have to be that, the United States is trying to contain China, or the United States is trying to keep China's rise from happening. It can be that the United States just doesn't want Chinese Communist Party influence in its own society, and the best way to prevent that is to invest in manufacturing, infrastructure, industrial base, research and development, and in STEM education in the United States, rather than allowing all of that to go to China to be repackaged in Chinese Communist Party ideology and re-exported to the world. It's absolutely critical, and I think the chief challenge here is, can we step away from our day-to-day lives and step away from the world as we see it every day when we answer our inbox, and begin to see the world in connections maybe that we hadn't seen before. And it really requires you to think deeply about the world that you live in. We live as military members and people in national security professionals, we live in two lives. We live a life that is in the environment of our work in the military space. But then we live a completely different life outside when you go home. Think about kind of the information technology capability and the interaction and collaboration that you have in the military, which is very stilted. And then think about what you have in the private in your private life, where you can have access to Facebook and Twitter and all of these different things that, quite frankly, aren't things that we really interact too much with on the military side. And I think, being able to step back and kind of look at those two worlds and understanding that, this one's moving much faster than the military side, and we need to understand those implications. I think you can't do that working day to day. So you need to get out, you need to be exposed to new information, but then you need to process that information, and you need to have this this interaction with your classmates where you begin to discuss what are the implications of things that, quite frankly, I don't deal with in my day-to-day life in the military, but is so important to understanding the world as it works today. I think that just having that opportunity to get away, to be exposed to some new information, to be exposed to different viewpoints, but then to critically think about your role in national security and how you can bring more insight, more understanding, and certainly a better approach to protecting the American people.